America, the people govern, the people rule, and the people are sovereign. I was elected not to take power, but to give power to the American people where it belongs. In foreign affairs, we are renewing this founding principle of sovereignty. Our government's first duty is to its people, to our citizens, to serve their needs, to ensure their safety, to preserve their rights, and to defend their values. As President of the United States, I will always put America first, just like you, as the leaders of your countries, will always and should always put your countries first. All responsible leaders have an obligation to serve their own citizens, and the nation-state remains the best vehicle for elevating the human condition. But making a better life for our people also requires us to work together in close harmony and unity to create a more safe and peaceful future for all people. The United States will forever be a great friend to the world, and especially to its allies. But we can no longer be taken advantage of or enter into a one-sided deal where the United States gets nothing in return. As long as I hold this office, I will defend America's interests above all else, but in fulfilling our obligations to our own nations. We also realize that it's in everyone's interest to seek a future where all nations can be sovereign, prosperous, and secure. America does more than speak for the values expressed in the United Nations Charter. Our citizens have paid the ultimate price to defend our freedom and the freedom of many nations represented in this great hall. America's devotion is measured on the battlefields where our young men and women have fought and sacrificed alongside of our allies. From the beaches of Europe to the deserts of the Middle East to the jungles of Asia. It is an eternal credit to the American character that even after we and our allies emerged victorious from the bloodiest war in history, we did not seek territorial expansion or attempt to oppose and impose our way of life on others. Instead, we helped build institutions such as this one to defend the sovereignty, security, and prosperity for all. For the diverse nations of the world, this is our hope. We want harmony and friendship, not conflict and strife. We are guided by outcomes, not ideology. We have a policy of principled realism rooted in shared goals, interests, and values. That realism forces us to confront a question facing every leader and nation in this room. It is a question we cannot escape or avoid. We will slide down the path of complacency, numb to the challenges, threats, and even wars that we face? Or do we have enough strength and pride to confront those dangers today so that our citizens can enjoy peace and prosperity tomorrow? If we desire to lift up our citizens, if we aspire to the approval of history, then we must fulfill our sovereign duties to the people we faithfully represent. We must protect our nations, their interests, and their futures. We must reject threats to sovereignty from the Ukraine to the South China Sea. We must uphold respect for law, respect for borders, and respect for culture, and the peaceful engagement these allow. And just as the founders of this body intended, we must work together and confront together those who threaten us with chaos, turmoil, and terror. The scourge of our planet today is a small group of rogue regimes that violate every principle on which the United Nations is based. They respect neither their own citizens nor the sovereign rights of their countries. If the righteous many do not confront the wicked few, then evil will triumph. When decent people and nations become bystanders to history, the forces of destruction only gather power and strength. No one has shown more contempt for other nations and for the well-being of their own people than the depraved regime in North Korea. It is responsible for the starvation deaths of millions of North Koreans and for the imprisonment, torture, killing, and oppression of countless more. We were all witness to the regime's deadly abuse when an innocent American college student, Otto Warmbier, was returned to America only to die a few days later. We saw it in the assassination of the dictator's brother using banned nerve agents in an international airport. We know it kidnapped a sweet 13-year-old Japanese girl from a beach in her own country to enslave her as a language tutor for North Korea's spies. If this is not twisted enough, now North Korea's reckless pursuit of nuclear weapons and ballistic missiles threatens the entire world with unthinkable loss of human life. It is an outrage that some nations would not only trade with such a regime, but would arm, supply, and financially support a country that imperils the world with nuclear conflict. No nation on earth has an interest in seeing this band of criminals arm itself with nuclear weapons and missiles. The United States has great strength and patience, but if it is forced to defend itself or its allies, we will have no choice but to totally destroy North Korea. Rocket Man is on a suicide mission for himself and for his regime. The United States is ready, willing, and able, but hopefully this will not be necessary. That's what the United Nations is all about. That's what the United Nations is for. Let's see how they do. It is time for North Korea to realize that the denuclearization is its only acceptable future. The United Nations Security Council recently held 2 unanimous 15-0 votes adopting hard-hitting resolutions against North Korea, and I want to thank China and Russia for joining the vote to impose sanctions along with all of the other members of the Security Council. Thank you to all involved. But we must do much more. It is time for all nations to work together to isolate the Kim regime until it ceases its hostile behavior. We face this decision not only in North Korea. It is far past time for the nations of the world to confront another reckless regime, one that speaks openly of mass murder, vowing death to America, destruction to Israel, and ruin for many leaders and nations in this room. The Iranian government masks a corrupt dictatorship behind the false guise of a democracy. It has turned a wealthy country with a rich history and culture into an economically depleted rogue state whose chief exports are violence, bloodshed, and chaos. The longest suffering victims of Iran's leaders are, in fact, its own people. Rather than use its resources to improve Iranian lives, its oil profits go to fund Hezbollah and other terrorists that kill innocent Muslims and attack their peaceful Arab and Israeli neighbors. This wealth, which rightly belongs to Iran's people, also goes to shore up Bashar al-Assad's dictatorship, fuel Yemen's civil war, and undermine peace throughout the entire Middle East. We cannot let a murderous regime continue these destabilizing activities while building dangerous missiles, and we cannot abide by an agreement if it provides cover for the eventual construction of a nuclear program. The Iran deal was one of the worst and most one-sided transactions the United States has ever entered into. Frankly, that deal is an embarrassment to the United States, and I don't think you've heard the last of it, believe me. It is time for the entire world to join us in demanding that Iran's government end its pursuit of death and destruction. It is time for the regime to free all Americans and citizens of other nations that they have unjustly detained. And above all, Iran's government must stop supporting terrorists, begin serving its own people, and respect the sovereign rights of its neighbors. The entire world understands that the good people of Iran want change. And other than the vast military power of the United States, that Iran's people are what their leaders fear the most. This is what causes the regime to restrict internet access, tear down satellite dishes, shoot unarmed student protesters, and imprison political reformers. Oppressive regimes cannot endure forever, and the day will come when the people will face a choice. Will they continue down the path of poverty, bloodshed, and terror? Or will the Iranian people return to the nation's proud roots as a center of civilization, culture, and wealth, where their people can be happy and prosperous once again? The Iranian regime's support for terror is in stark contrast to the recent commitments of many of its neighbors to fight terrorism and halt its financing. In Saudi Arabia early last year, I was greatly honored to address the leaders of more than 50 Arab and Muslim nations. We agreed that all responsible nations must work together to confront terrorists and the Islamic extremism that inspires them. We will stop radical Islamic terrorism because we cannot allow it to tear up our nation and indeed to tear up the entire world. We must deny the terrorists safe haven, transit, funding, and any form of support for their vile and sinister ideology. We must drive them out of our nations. It is time to expose and hold responsible those countries who support and finance terror groups like Al-Qaeda, Hezbollah, the Taliban, and others that slaughter innocent people. The United States and our allies are working together throughout the Middle East to crush the loser terrorists and stop the reemergence of safe havens they use to launch attacks on all of our people. Last month, I announced a new strategy for victory in the fight against this evil in Afghanistan. From now on, our security interests will dictate the length and scope of military operations, not arbitrary benchmarks and timetables set up by politicians. I have also totally changed the rules of engagement in our fight against the Taliban and other terrorist groups. In Syria and Iraq, we have made big gains toward lasting defeat of ISIS. In fact, our country has achieved more against ISIS in the last 8 months than it has in many, many years combined. We seek the de-escalation of the Syrian conflict and a political solution that honors the will of the Syrian people. The actions of the criminal regime of Bashar al-Assad, including the use of chemical weapons against his own citizens, even innocent children, shock the conscience of every decent person. No society can be safe if banned chemical weapons are allowed to spread. That is why the United States carried out a missile strike on the airbase that launched the attack. We appreciate the efforts of the United Nations agencies that are providing vital humanitarian assistance in areas liberated from ISIS, and we especially thank Jordan, Turkey, and Lebanon for their role in hosting refugees from the Syrian conflict. The United States is a compassionate nation and has spent billions and billions of dollars in helping to support this effort. We seek an approach to refugee resettlement that is designed to help these horribly treated people and which enables their eventual return to their home countries to be part of the rebuilding process. For the cost of resettling one refugee in the United States, we can assist more than 10 in their home region. Out of the goodness of our hearts, we offer financial assistance to hosting countries in the region, and we support recent agreements of the G20 nations that will seek to host refugees as close to their home countries as possible. This is the safe, responsible, and humanitarian approach. For decades, the United States has dealt with migration challenges here in the Western Hemisphere. We have learned that over the long term, uncontrolled migration is deeply unfair to both the sending and the receiving countries. For the sending countries, it reduces domestic pressure to pursue needed political and economic reform and drains them of the human capital necessary to motivate and implement those reforms. For the receiving countries, the substantial costs of uncontrolled migration are borne overwhelmingly by low-income citizens whose concerns are often ignored by both media and government. I want to salute the work of the United Nations in seeking to address the problems that cause people to flee from their homes. The United Nations and African Union led peacekeeping missions to have invaluable contributions in stabilizing conflicts in Africa. The United States continues to lead the world in humanitarian assistance, including famine prevention and relief in South Sudan, Somalia, and northern Nigeria and Yemen. We have invested in better health and opportunity all over the world through programs like PEPFAR, which funds AIDS relief, the President's Malaria Initiative, the Global Health Security Agenda, the Global Fund to End Modern Slavery, and the Woman Entrepreneurs Finance Initiative, part of our commitment to empowering women all across the globe. We also thank the Secretary General for recognizing that the United Nations must reform if it is to be an effective partner in confronting threats to sovereignty, security, and prosperity. Too often, the focus of this organization has not been on results, but on bureaucracy and process. In some cases, states that seek to subvert this institution's noble aims have hijacked the very systems that are supposed to advance them. For example, it is a massive source of embarrassment to the United Nations that some governments with egregious human rights records sit on the UN Human Rights Council. The United States is one out of 193 countries in the United Nations, and yet we pay 22% of the entire budget and more. In fact, we pay far more than anybody realizes. The United States bears an unfair cost burden, but to be fair, if it could actually accomplish all of its stated goals, especially the goal of peace, this investment would easily be well worth it. Major portions of the world are in conflict, and some, in fact, are going to hell. But the powerful people in this room, under the guidance and auspices of the United Nations, can solve many of these vicious and complex problems. The American people hope that one day soon the United Nations can be a much more accountable and effective advocate for human dignity and freedom around the world. In the meantime, we believe that no nation should have to bear a disproportionate share of the burden, militarily or financially. Nations of the world must take a greater role in promoting secure and prosperous societies in their own regions. That is why in the Western Hemisphere, the United States has stood against the corrupt, destabilizing regime in Cuba and embraced the enduring dream of the Cuban people to live in freedom. My administration recently announced that we will not lift sanctions on the Cuban government until it makes fundamental reforms. We have also imposed tough, calibrated sanctions on the socialist Maduro regime in Venezuela, which has brought a once thriving nation to the brink of total collapse. The socialist dictatorship of Nicolas Maduro has inflicted terrible pain and suffering on the good people of that country. This corrupt regime destroyed a prosperous nation by imposing a failed ideology that has produced poverty and misery everywhere it has been tried. To make matters worse, Maduro has defied his own people, stealing power from their elected representatives to preserve his disastrous rule. The Venezuelan people are starving, and their country is collapsing. Their democratic institutions are being destroyed. This situation is completely unacceptable, and we cannot stand by and watch. As a responsible neighbor and friend, we and all others have a goal. That goal is to help them regain their freedom, recover their country, and restore their democracy. I would like to thank leaders in this room for condemning the regime and providing vital support to the Venezuelan people. The United States has taken important steps to hold the regime accountable. We are prepared to take further action if the government of Venezuela persists on its path to impose authoritarian rule on the Venezuelan people. We are fortunate to have incredibly strong and healthy trade relationships with many of the Latin American countries gathered here today. Our economic bond forms a critical foundation for advancing peace and prosperity for all of our people and all of our neighbors. I ask every country represented here today to be prepared to do more to address this very real crisis. We call for the full restoration of democracy, and political freedoms in Venezuela. The problem in Venezuela is not that socialism has been poorly implemented, but that socialism has been faithfully implemented. From the Soviet Union to Cuba to Venezuela, wherever true socialism or communism has been adopted, it has delivered anguish and devastation and failure. Those who preach the tenets of these discredited ideologies only contribute to the continued suffering of the people who live under these cruel systems. America stands with every person living under a brutal regime. Our respect for sovereignty is also a call for action. All people deserve a government that cares for their safety, their interests, and their well-being, including their prosperity. In America, we seek stronger ties of business and trade with all nations of goodwill. But this trade must be fair and it must be reciprocal. For too long, the American people were told that mammoth multinational trade deals, unaccountable international tribunals, and powerful global bureaucracies were the best way to promote their success. But as those promises flowed, millions of jobs vanished and thousands of factories disappeared. Others gamed the system and broke the rules. And our great middle class, once the bedrock of American prosperity, was forgotten and left behind. But they are forgotten no more, and they will never be forgotten again. While America will pursue cooperation and commerce with other nations, we are renewing our commitment to the first duty of every government, the duty of our citizens. This bond is the source of America's strength and that of every responsible nation represented here today. If this organization is to have any hope of successfully confronting the challenges before us, it will depend, as President Truman said some 70 years ago, on the independent strength of its members. If we are to embrace the opportunities of the future and overcome the present dangers together, there can be no substitute for strong, sovereign, and independent nations. Nations that are rooted in their histories and invested in their destinies. Nations that seek allies to befriend, not enemies to conquer. And most important of all, nations that are home to patriots, to men and women who are willing to sacrifice for their countries, their fellow citizens, and for all that is best in the human spirit. In remembering the great victory that led to this body's founding, we must never forget that those heroes who fought against evil also fought for the nations that they loved. Patriotism led the Poles to die to save Poland, the French to fight for a free France, and the Brits to stand strong for Britain. Today, if we do not invest ourselves, our hearts, and our minds in our nations, if we will not build strong families, safe communities, and healthy societies for ourselves, no one can do it for us. We cannot wait for someone else, for faraway countries or far-off bureaucracies. We can't do it. We must solve our problems to build our prosperity, to secure our future, or we will build vulnerable to decay, domination, and defeat. The true question for the United Nations today, for people all over the world who hope for better lives for themselves and their children, is a basic one. Are we still patriots? Do we love our nations enough to protect their sovereignty and to take ownership of their futures? Do we revere them enough to defend their interests, preserve their cultures, and ensure a peaceful world for their citizens? One of the greatest American patriots, John Adams, wrote that the American Revolution was effected before the war commenced. The revolution was in the minds and hearts of the people. That was the moment when America awoke, when we looked around and understood that we were a nation. We realized who we were, what we valued, and what we would give our lives to defend. From its very first moments, the American story is the story of what is possible when people take ownership of their future. The United States of America has been among the greatest forces for good in the history of the world, and the greatest defenders of sovereignty, security, and prosperity for all. Now we are calling for a great reawakening of nations, for the revival of their spirits, their pride, their people, and their patriotism. History is asking us whether we are up to the task. Our answer will be a renewal of will, a rediscovery of resolve, and a rebirth of devotion we need to defeat the enemies of humanity and unlock the potential of life itself. Our hope is a word and world of proud, independent nations that embrace their duties, seek friendship, respect others, and make common cause in the greatest shared interest of all, a future of dignity and peace for the people of this wonderful earth. This is the true vision of the United Nations, the ancient wish of every people, and the deepest yearning that lives inside every sacred soul. So let this be our mission, and let this be our message to the world. We will fight together, sacrifice together, and stand together for peace, for freedom, for justice, for family, for humanity, and for the Almighty God who made us all. Thank you. God bless you. God bless the nations of the world, and God bless the United States of America. Thank you very much.
On behalf of the General Assembly.
All right there, President Donald Trump delivering his very first address at the UN General Assembly. The president making a lot of points. I wrote them down. North Korea he talked about. He talked about the Iran nuclear deal. He talked about Cuba, Venezuela, Afghanistan. We're going to dig into everything. Syria, we're going to dig into everything right now with Ted Picone. He's still with us, joining us from Washington. He's a senior fellow at the Brookings Institute. So, all right, Ted, let's unravel some of the things the president talked about. Clearly, America First was a big portion of this speech, referencing
almost like bookends.
Yeah,
he started with it and he finished
with it. For a lot of those folks sitting in that UN General Assembly, I'm sure they have very little connection or understanding of John Adams and some of the things that the president talked about that are uniquely American, the American middle class. On the other hand, threatening, I think for the first time at the UN General Assembly, to destroy another nation, that must be a first.
No, it was a remarkable speech, and it was a serious speech, and I think it was covering a lot of ground, speaking to the American people, but also speaking to people all over the world. I mean, this is the biggest global platform he's had so far to finally explain what he means by America First and what I heard was the word sovereignty over and over and over again. He is reasserting the primacy of the nation state in the international system as the way to get things done. That if you don't have strong individual free states, and he used the word freedom several times, you won't have a strong UN, you won't have peace. And I think that's a good fundamental message to get across, although to many other states it's probably music to their ears. And I'm thinking including some authoritarian states like Russia and China who say, yes, this is our business, don't impose your form of government on us, and we'll do things the way we want. So the big message of nation states, patriotism, I think gives a lot of room for interpretation that will be heard well by all sides of the debate.
That is the question that I had for you, Ted, and you sort of addressed it there. Certainly for a lot of people, listening to the president talk about sovereignty is something that they are going to take to heart. And it's one thing for the French president or the Germans or some of the other countries that have democratic institutions to hear that and say, yes, we agree. And it's quite another for the leaders of China, for the leaders of North Korea, for the leaders of Saudi Arabia, frankly, when the president talked about countries that have human rights violations that sit on the Human Rights Council at the United Nations. Saudi Arabia is a major partner of the United States. They have been accused of violating human rights.
And he also made it a point of saying that America doesn't try to impose American values on other countries. And I thought that exact same thing about Saudi Arabia. Let us, though, sort of pick out some bites for people, some bites, TV language, some of the sound that we heard from the president. And I think perhaps the most sort of jarring statement was about North Korea. So let's play some of that, and then we can talk about it afterwards.
Sure.
No one has shown more contempt for other nations and for the well-being of their own people than the depraved regime in North Korea. It is responsible for the starvation deaths of millions of North Koreans and for the imprisonment, torture, killing, and oppression of countless more. We were all witness to the regime's deadly abuse when an innocent American college student, Otto Warmbier, was returned to America only to die a few days later. We saw it in the assassination of the dictator's brother using banned nerve agents in an international airport. We know it kidnapped a sweet 13-year-old Japanese girl from a beach in her own country to enslave her as a language tutor for North Korea's spies. If this is not twisted enough, now North Korea's reckless pursuit of nuclear weapons and ballistic missiles threatens the entire world with unthinkable loss of human life. It is an outrage that some nations would not only trade with such a regime, but would arm, supply, and financially support a country that imperils the world with nuclear conflict. No nation on earth.
All right, you've just been listening there to one of the moments there that President Trump indicated, again, going back to this theme of sovereignty that he has during the course of this speech hit over and over again. We want to bring in Jasmine El-Gamal. She's a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council. She's joining us right here in New York City. We still have Ted Picone. He's in Washington with us right now. So Jasmine, let's bring you into the discussion. Let me just get your first thoughts on what you heard today.
I thought it was a pretty solid speech from his perspective. I don't think we saw any huge surprises. He basically laid out a lot of the themes that Secretary Haley and General McMaster had previewed at the press conference a few days ago. He talked about sovereignty of nations. He talked about burden sharing. He made sure to highlight all the contributions that the U.S. has made to the UN, very similar to what he said to NATO leaders when he was at NATO earlier this year. Very tough on Iran, tough on North Korea, tough on rogue regimes. Interestingly, no mention of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. I thought that was one notable thing that was sort of missing from the speech. But other than that, I thought it was fairly predictable.
We had just played a portion where he was talking about North Korea. In that portion, what we did not play, Vlad, was where he said that, you know, if North Korea continued its pursuit, there would be no choice but to totally destroy North Korea. And then he used a phrase that he used in one of his tweets, calling Kim Jong-un Rocket Man, saying that Rocket Man was on a suicide mission for himself. I'll ask you first your take on it, then I want to get Ted's take on just the use of that kind of loose language.
I don't think
and
that,
direct threat.
Right. I mean, I don't think that was a surprise either. I think that we've seen President Trump, even when he's on a teleprompter and is doing fairly well in keeping to the script, he does like to pepper his speeches with these Trumpisms, as we call them, calling him Rocket Man, saying that some countries are going to hell or have gone to hell, talking about the loser terrorists, which is a phrase that he's used before. I think that he just feels the need to be a little colorful. I think it adds some drama to a very dry speech, probably in his opinion, and it also placates his base that wants to see him be a little bit more interesting than just the average UN world leader.
Right.
Ted, what do you think?
I would agree with that general point, but the overall thrust of it was isolate this regime. They are beyond the pale. If there's any one country you could point to where there's largely a strong consensus on what to do about it and how to address it, and that there is a major threat, it's North Korea. And I think he both thanked some countries for taking the steps at the UN Security Council on sanctions, but he also made it very clear that much more has to be done. It's not going to go away. And, you know, these kinds of one-off lines about Rocket Man are funny and interesting, but the thrust of the message was very clear. It was very threatening, and it says, we're not going to drop this.
It is sort of interesting to me, and Ted, you mentioned this, that the theme of this speech was sovereignty, but by my count, the president, it seemed to me that there was sort of a schizophrenic nature at some level here, because the president clearly, when it comes to the UN and the American contribution in terms of dollars and cents to the United Nations, that's something that he wants to revisit.
Right.
But he seemed to be indicating in many of the hotspots that he talked about where the United States would actually take some steps. Now, if the idea is that American sovereignty, America first, generally, historically, it's been inward looking, not outward looking. Here, he talked about destroying North Korea. He talked about not removing sanctions on Cuba. He talked about potential action in Venezuela.
And
he talked about Afghanistan.
The intervention in Syria as well, right?
So all of those things, they seem to go against the idea of America first. It doesn't appear to be, at least when you first listen to the speech, that he's talking about isolating America. He seems to still be engaged in many of those places that he mentioned.
Yeah, I didn't see it necessarily as an opportunity or an attempt to isolate America. I thought it was trying to put America in its place as a world leader, but making it very clear that we're not going to do it alone. Ambassador Haley talked about this at the press conference a few days ago when she talked about the strides that we've made in peacekeeping operations and UN reform. I think this is a theme. It's something that they've previewed. They're going to continue to talk about the need for the UN to reform. It's a good organization. On principle, it matters. But it needs to be reformed, and it needs to have a solid U.S. leadership role, but not a sole leadership role.
Ted, I want to ask you about the moments when there was spontaneous applause. And you can probably put this speech in context and how often people in the audience applause and when they don't. But there were a couple of times, but I think the first applause line was when, he talked about, once again, talking about the America First thing, and that not only should America be putting itself first, but the other countries should do that as well. And there was some spontaneous applause, but not applause across the entire room.
Yeah, I couldn't see from the camera who was applauding, and it was very few and far between. There was one other moment where people applauded his phrase about women's empowerment and all the other contributions the U.S. is making to, say, global health concerns and fighting AIDS, etc. Also, famine relief is an important U.S. priority. And I think what we heard today was a proactive U.S., not a retreating U.S. But then you compare it to the budget budget that this administration put forward to the Congress that slashes and burns all of these programs and contributions, Congress has stepped up and looks like it will push back hard and restore a lot of that money. But this is where there's some incoherence in the way the administration is addressing these issues, and maybe they're evolving.
Let's play another moment there from the president's speech at the UN General Assembly when he specifically talked about the Iran nuclear deal, calling it one of the worst deals the United States ever entered into. Let's take a listen to that.
The Iran deal was one of the worst and most one-sided transactions the United States has ever entered into. Frankly, that deal is an embarrassment to the United States, and I don't think you've heard the last of it. Believe me. It is time for the entire world to join us in demanding that Iran's government end its pursuit of death and destruction. It is time for the regime to free all Americans and citizens of other nations that they have unjustly detained. And above all, Iran's government must stop supporting terrorists, begin serving its own people, and respect the sovereign rights of its neighbors.
All right, so a couple of things there, Jasmine. The president talking and saying it's the worst deal the United States ever entered into. It's an embarrassment. And yet, independent watchdogs have said that Iran is holding to the agreement that was reached under the previous administration. There are issues clearly that need to be addressed in terms of their sponsoring of some terrorist organizations as the United States sees them. But it appears to be working. But this is something the president talked about on the campaign trail, and it seems as if he's throwing that out to those folks who supported him, that this is something that he's going to be reworking. And we know that he met with Prime Minister Netanyahu, and of course, Bibi Netanyahu hates this deal.
Right. Yes, Bibi obviously hates this deal. I think the president has made it clear during the campaign that this was a deal that he didn't like. He thought it was a bad deal, that we got the raw end of the deal. I think it's something that he knew his base wanted to hear. The thing is, Iran is pretty much complying with the deal. There isn't anything that we can point to specifically to say that they're not. And so what you've heard members of the administration do is talk about the spirit of the deal. And that's a little bit different, but it's something that they can get Iran on and put them on notice and say, we won't be afraid to kind of take tough steps and use tough words against you if you're not complying 100%.
I mean, if the deal was reached to prevent Iran from gaining nuclear weapons, and by all independent accounts, that seems to be what is happening there in that state, why would the president characterize it as the worst deal? Why would he characterize it as an embarrassment?
Yeah, I think this was overdone on this part of his speech, and it's consistent with what he said in the past. But to call it an embarrassment to the U.S. actually, I think, it isolates the United States from the general international opinion that this is a good deal. What he's trying to do is link the deal to Iran's other behavior in the region and support for terrorism, etc. And I think that creates some problems because you're trying to unpack something good to address another part of the problem. And that other part of the problem does need to be addressed, and it's worth having that debate. I just don't think the linkage works.
All right, Ted Picone, Senior Fellow with the Brookings Institute. I know you have to go, so thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
And Jasmine, I wanted to ask you, was there a topic that he did not bring up that you were surprised that he didn't bring up? I know a lot of people have talked about him meeting with Emmanuel Macron and perhaps the Paris Accord, and climate change might be a topic. What do you say?
I think the only one that I was surprised not to hear anything about was the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, especially since he's basically deputized Jared Kushner. He's obviously prioritizing making moves to try to get a deal, but I think that he wants deliberately take the opposite approach that President Obama took, which was lay it out right at the start. Remember, President Obama talked about settlements right off the bat. It was not very well received by the Israelis, so I think President Trump wants to make it clear that this is a different method of negotiation. You're probably going to see a lot of behind-the-scenes movement on it, but not as much public rhetoric.
What do you make of something that Ted said earlier, which is the spirit of this speech is going to give credence to some authoritarians around the world, specifically thinking in countries where the rule of law doesn't necessarily exist in the way that it does in the United States? If you hear the President of the United States, the leader of the free world, saying every country should do what is in their own interest, that ranges from China to now what we're seeing in Myanmar, to Saudi Arabia, to other countries saying, look, this is in our best interest. We are going to do this. When it comes to women's rights, this is what we're going to do. When it comes to, folks that may be protesting the government, we're going to put them down because it's in the best interest of the majority of the people in the country. What do you make of that?
I think this is an approach that's very much becoming one of his trademarks, which is this combination of emphasis on sovereignty and also this theme where he says the U.S. is not going to tell people what to do, we're not going to tell people how to live. Remember, he said that in Saudi Arabia too when he was talking to Arab and Muslim leaders, basically saying you do what you need to do. I mean, this is a president who's prioritized counterterrorism, the fight against ISIS, and he knows that there are some trade-offs that are going to have to be taken by countries in the fight against terrorism and other priorities of the Trump administration. So he basically is saying over and over again, I understand you're going to have to do what you need to do. We're not here to lecture you. We're not here to judge you. We're here to work together on these issues of mutual concern, and that's all he's going to say about that in public.
This speech seemed to be directed sort of 50% at the leaders that were in the audience right in front of him, and the rest of it at the people, his constituents, people in the United States. I mean, he talked about the middle class, and he opened sort of bragging about the successes, right? The stock market is up, and people have jobs, and stuff like that. Seems really domestic.
It did have a little bit of a campaign style speech, but I mean, we see that in most of his speeches, so I wasn't really surprised by that. Even in the way that he kind of paused after saying things, just kind of waiting for the applause.
I think he was surprised that there wasn't a lot of applause after some of those lines that he's used to great acclaim in the United States.
Do we have a little bit of sound, John? Okay, let's listen to a little bit of this.
The Iran deal was one of the worst and most one-sided transactions the United States has ever entered into. Frankly, that deal is an embarrassment to the United States, and I don't think you've heard the last of it, believe me. It is time for the entire world to join us in demanding that Iran's government end its pursuit of death and destruction. It is time for the regime to free all Americans and citizens of other nations that they have unjustly detained. And above all, Iran's government must stop supporting terrorists, begin serving its own people, and respect the sovereign rights of its neighbors. Will forever be a great friend to the world, and especially to its allies. But we can no longer be taken advantage of or enter into a one-sided deal where the United States gets nothing in return. As long as I hold this office, I will defend America's interests above all else. But in fulfilling our obligations to our own nations, we also realize that it's in everyone's interest to seek a future where all nations can be sovereign, prosperous, and secure.
All right, that had a little more of an international feel. We started with the comments on Iran, but eventually it was the America First idea. But what we were talking about was his sort of very domestic campaign-style lines that seemed to have been thrown in at the beginning and at the end of that speech.
Yeah, I think, and again, we've seen this in many of his speeches to international audience. He always has one ear out for the domestic audience, for his base. This is a president who is very clear on why he was elected and what his base expects of him, and so he makes it a real point to mention all of that stuff, and I think they love it.
All right.
Let's before we let you go, Jasmine, I want to get your reaction to one more time. I want to play that moment when the President of the United States, there at the UN General Assembly, threatened North Korea. Let's play that.
No one has shown more contempt for other nations and for the well-being of their own people than the depraved regime in North Korea. It is responsible for the starvation deaths of millions of North Koreans and for the imprisonment, torture, killing, and oppression of countless more. We were all witness to the regime's deadly abuse when an innocent American college student, Otto Warmbier, was returned to America only to die a few days later. We saw it in the assassination of the dictator's brother using banned nerve agents in an international airport. We know it kidnapped a sweet 13-year-old Japanese girl from a beach in her own country to enslave her as a language tutor for North Korea's spies. If this is not twisted enough, now North Korea's reckless pursuit of nuclear weapons and ballistic missiles threatens the entire world with unthinkable loss of human life. It is an outrage that some nations would not only trade with such a regime, but would arm, supply, and financially support a country that imperils the world with nuclear conflict.
The president went on to say, I think the key moment there was, we will have no choice but to totally destroy North Korea. On one hand, Jasmine, in the earlier the comments at the beginning of those thoughts, the president made a very good point that North Korea has done some of these things, that they have taken away human rights, they have killed people, they've murdered people, and they are pursuing this nuclear threat. On the other, to sit there at the United Nations and talk about destroying a country, what are your thoughts on that?
It was pretty dramatic. I mean, it was really harsh. I don't think I expected him to be as harsh as he was. I knew he was going to say some tough words. I mean, this has been a theme in constant administration statements and interviews, trying to set the tone and to set the stage for potential action down the road, basically saying, okay, we're giving you this chance and this other chance, but we're letting you know this is not acceptable. And so I maybe was a little surprised that he said Rocket Man at the United Nations.
But maybe a lot of people weren't.
But maybe a lot of people weren't. Yeah.
All right.
Jasmine El Gamal, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yeah, it was really great having
Thanks
your
so
analysis.
much.
We appreciate it.
Thank you.
Let's bring in our Margaret Brennan, who's also joining us now. She's at the United Nations there in New York, right here in New York City, we should say. Margaret, so we just played some of those key moments from the president's speech. There's so much to unravel. What stood out to you?
Wow, there's quite a lot. This was not, I don't think people expected the president to use as strong a language as he did, even though White House officials did say that it would be, extremely harsh to call out Kim Jong-un, the leader of North Korea, as Rocket Man being on a suicide mission, of saying the U.S. may not have any choice but to destroy, basically to annihilate North Korea if Kim Jong-un does not back down. I mean, these are words that are not typically heard from the podium of an institution that was built to promote peace and international cooperation. This place was built out of the ashes of war to try to avoid another one. So this was very unusual language from an American president, at least. That stood out. Also, the president really took to task a number of rogue regimes. An extensive part of his remarks was spent on Venezuela in particular. Interesting there because he talked about needing to restore democracy. Earlier, the president had said the U.S. will no longer try to impose its way of life or its value system on others. So those two things seemed a bit discordant. The president also spent a tremendous amount of time on Iran, calling it out for imprisoning Americans, calling it out for its destabilizing activities in the Middle East, and then hinting at a decision he has not yet fully made, which is what will happen with the existing agreement to freeze Iran's nuclear program. And this is a decision that the president said he called the agreement itself an embarrassment. Remember, this is one that's enshrined in international law, so what he's saying here is a word of warning to our allies and to Iran that he is seriously considering either pulling out or trying to renegotiate a deal that all of our allies and Iran and the UN say cannot be renegotiated.
And Margaret, there was a lot of talk prior to the speech about how he would use America First as a frame, and he almost sort of used it as a literary frame. It surrounded the speech at the beginning and at the end.
He did. That term sovereignty, we were told, was something that the president was going to use a lot. And to him, that is sort of how he tried to square the America First worldview that he advocated on the campaign trail, being very nationalistic. Some would say isolationist, with the argument here at a body that's built for and by globalists to try to get everyone to work together to solve these problems. So he rhetorically tried to thread the needle that way, but some of that language, particularly that word sovereignty, is a loaded term for countries who in the past have resisted the U.S. calls for respect of human rights. Syria, for one of them, they use the term sovereignty quite a lot, and they have a very different definition of what that means. For the president today, when he was using it, he said it means countries really need to shoulder more of the burden and to handle their issues themselves, but still come together to counter common threats.
Yeah, Margaret, and it was interesting as we were listening to the president deliver those remarks, we heard some sporadic clapping and we weren't sure who was clapping. We know that in the past, some of the president's own people in speeches that he delivers are known to clap for him when he says something that they agree with. But I'm sort of curious, and this will probably be part of what you and others will be reporting over the days and the next couple of days and weeks ahead, which is how other countries will interpret the president's words. Certainly when the president pointed out that there are countries that sit on the UN Human Rights Council that have human rights violations, it's easy to point fingers at Syria, it's easy to point fingers at Zimbabwe, for example, but you've got to also look at Russia, you've got to also look at Iran, you've got to also look at a lot of countries that the United States, for example, Saudi Arabia, does business with.
He did, and if the president did leave himself some wiggle room on Iran. If you notice the language he used, he said the U.S. will not abide by an agreement that would allow Iran to eventually have a nuclear program. He's talking about the fact that that deal will basically unfreeze in 10 years. That's the sunset clause of that. So he's hinting at, well, maybe there's a way if we can tackle this one particular issue, I won't go through and tear it up. On the human rights issues, it was interesting who he called out and who he didn't. As you say, Russia, not really any mention other than to thank them for supporting sanctions on North Korea. He nodded to their interference in Ukraine, didn't call on them to stop acting in Syria. I suspect that's because of some of the diplomacy that's happening here behind the scenes with Rex Tillerson, the Secretary of State, and Russia's foreign minister, who in fact will be meeting today. They met as well on Sunday to try to de-escalate. So it's an interesting choice of where to choose to call out human rights violations and where to say the U.S. isn't going to interfere anymore. And the president said both of those things in this speech.
Margaret Brennan at the United Nations. Thanks a lot, Margaret. Of course, after the break, we'll have a lot more news, including an update on Hurricane Maria, now barreling towards Puerto Rico.